Hello, everybody. So I want to welcome you to the webinar series of the Animal Law section of the State Bar of Michigan. My name is Allie Phillips, and I am the 2020-2021 chair of the section, and I'm also founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together. Before we begin, I would like to share a little about the Animal Law section that you may not be aware of. We were the first statewide animal law section in the United States, and we were created in 1995. So we have been celebrating our 25th anniversary for well over a year now and have been really enjoying all the accomplishments of the section. Our section is comprised of more than 200 animal law professionals. We promote public policy and legislation to advance the protection of animals, and you can find our policy statements on our website, which is at mishbar.org, and you can see that link at the bottom of the screen. We offer a newsletter for our attorney and law student members that goes out about 2 to 4 times a year and has since 1997, thanks to one of the current and founding members, Don Garlett. We put on educational events, typically one annual event, but due to our current situation, the symposium committee of the section has launched this webinar series. So this is our 4th webinar. So thank you, B. Friedlander, who is a founding section member, Ann Griffin, who is past chair, and Kate Brindle, who is chair-elect, for working together with me to make this happen. We also give several awards annually, one to a law student, one to a legislator or lawyer, one to an animal advocate. Any attorney or law student is welcome to join our section. So today, I am going to stop sharing my screen if Hilary wants to go ahead and share hers. So I'd like to introduce our presenters today. So Hilary Hager has spent the last 20 years managing volunteers in animal welfare environments and currently serves as the Senior Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Humane Society of the United States. She teaches compassion fatigue workshops around the country to help provide members of the animal protection community the support and resources to maintain their own well-being while working in a challenging and emotionally charged environment. In addition to managing volunteers in shelters, Hilary has been a volunteer herself at a wildlife rehab center in Washington and served on the board of directors for a chimpanzee sanctuary, the Washington State Federation of Animal Care and Control Agencies, and a Friends of nonprofit group supporting the work of a municipally owned and operated shelter. Lindsay Hamrick is the director for shelter outreach and engagement at the Humane Society of the United States, where she works to strengthen partnerships with animal shelters and rescue organizations. Through mentorship, training, policy initiatives, and grants, the shelter outreach team aims to support and lift up animal welfare organizations, large and small, to serve pets and the people who love them. She holds a BS in animal science and a BS in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an MS in animals and public policy from Tufts Veterinary School. She previously served as the Director of Policy for Companion Animals, advancing fair housing policies, supporting humane community cat programs, and ending breed-specific legislation. Prior to her role in advocacy, she spent a decade as the CEO or the COO overseeing animal shelter operations, including behavioral, medical, adoption, and owner support programs at 3 of New Hampshire's rural animal shelters, as well as a stint at a large urban shelter with an intake of over 30,000 animals per year. As a certified professional dog trainer, Lindsay has deployed to assist victims of dog fighting and puppy mills and regularly volunteers and fosters for her local animal shelter. So I will let you take it from here, and thank you so much on behalf of the Animal Law section for sharing this really, really important topic.
Well, thank you for having us, Allie. Really appreciate it. Thank you for, it's always so strange to sort of sit and listen to somebody talking about your own credentials, but thanks for the introduction and thanks for having us. Glad to have the conversation. Lindsay's gonna probably do a little bit more to introduce herself in the context of this work a little bit later, but I will kick us off to sort of dive into a very brief jogging tour of compassion fatigue and building resilience and how this shows up and affects our work. All of that, all of the kind of credentials that you just heard about me and my experience have led me to this place where doing these workshops and having these conversations just feels so, so important to me. You know, we have gotten so much better in nearly every aspect of the work that we do for animals in all areas, whether it's enforcement, around the law, around policy, keeping animals in homes, customer service, veterinary care, enrichment, all of the things that we do to protect animals broadly in our society. We've gotten so much better at it. And also, in my mind, it doesn't matter how well we do our jobs if we're miserable while we do it. And my experience is there are a lot of people who really suffer as it relates to their work because we care so much about animals. We're called to do this work for them, and then we are consistently exposed to their suffering, and it can make it really, really difficult environment. And so I think this is a really essential conversation to have. And I think that there are people who understand what compassion fatigue looks like and know it's a thing, but maybe need a reminder. There are people who know compassion fatigue is a problem and don't have a lot of good strategies for how they might be able to address it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I also think that there are people who know that compassion fatigue is a thing, but don't think they have it. And I think that a lot of times, you know, I think that there are a lot of times where, you know, human behavior, just like all animal behavior, is driven by doing what we do because it works for us until it doesn't work anymore. And sometimes we're like the last people to know that something isn't working. And so, you know, a lot of times I see people come to these workshops and they're like, well, I'll come and learn about it, but I don't have compassion fatigue. I mean, whatever, I don't need this conversation. And my experience is that that's not always the case, that there's a lot of behavior that's really normalized in this work, that is normalized because like, oh, that's what happens to you, or it comes with the territory. And that's true. And it's true because it's compassion fatigue, but not necessarily because it's a normal or healthy way of coping with the stress that comes with this work. And so I think this is a really important conversation. I'm glad to be having it. I'm glad to be partnering, as always, with my dear friend, Lindsay, because I think this, like, you know, in order to have the space to do some of this stuff, to take care of ourselves, we have to like create the space in our lives to do it. And that means trying to create some work-life balance. And so she's got some really practical resources to share in that regard. So to kind of kick us off, you know, we've said compassion fatigue, and I will admit that I don't especially love the term, largely because I feel as though, I mean, it's gained some currency. People kind of understand that it's a thing, but it's also a little bit of a misleading term. You know, compassion fatigue sounds like you cared a lot and got tired. And really what compassion fatigue is it's sort of it's a consequence of caring. It's what happens when you care very deeply about this mission-driven work that you do and find that over time, your ability to continue to care at the same level is overwhelmed. And so the idea that people could be profoundly affected by their work first showed up in the literature in the early 1900s. And it was primarily focused on humans who were dealing with humans in crisis. And, you know, and a lot of the literature was around first responders and police officers who were, you know, interacting with people at really bad moments, who, you know, pulling people out of car accidents or out of burning buildings. And they were continuously sort of impacted by their exposure to the trauma that other people were experiencing. In the 80s, the conversation shifted to the experience of people working in animal shelters and doing that kind of direct care work. You know, and in the 80s, in animal shelters, there were many millions more animals coming in, and many millions more animals were being euthanized. So that sort of led to this idea that there's this correlation between compassion fatigue and euthanasia, which is not actually accurate. In fact, in my experience, a lot of the things that people sort of people attribute their compassion fatigue to usually relates to working with people and not working with the animals directly. I've been able to survey people before workshops and kind of get a sense of what's going on for them, and it's almost never euthanasia. It's like working with the public, lack of resources, organizational policies, things of that nature. And so certainly euthanasia can be a challenge for people, but that's not usually the thing. And then that also leads to this idea that people sometimes have that if there is no euthanasia involved, that people are somehow not entitled to experience compassion fatigue, which is also not the case. So it's not just something that is focused on people who are doing direct care. Anybody who's mission driven can experience compassion fatigue, right? So there are ecologists who are freaking out about collapsing frog populations who are experiencing compassion fatigue, attorneys working with separated families on the border, experiencing compassion fatigue, doctors and nurses working in ICUs around the country this last year and a half, experiencing compassion fatigue. So, it is, I think, sometimes feels a little bit different in this work because we have such a deep emotional connection to the animals that it just is so much more painful when we're exposed to their suffering. But it is, working with animals is a requirement for experiencing this. But what I think is important to kind of keep in mind as we talk about this is that it's not just that experiencing compassion fatigue affects your quality of life outside of work. And, as we'll talk more with Lindsay later, you might not have a lot of life outside of work, which is maybe part of the problem, and we'll try to put a pin in that and come back to it. But it also affects your ability to do your work. And I think that sometimes is the conversation that we need to spend a little bit more time having, because most of us overwork ourselves and try to do too much in order to be of better service to the animals. But while we are doing that, we are undermining our ability to do our best work, which means that we're not actually serving the animals in the way that we are intending. And so we must prioritize ourselves to take care of ourselves in order to be our best selves for the animals. I mean, you are entitled to take care of yourself just for you and for no one else. But if your narrative is like, I have to keep doing this for the animals, it's important to recognize that the animals really need you at your best. And as an aside, I had this sort of revelation, it's probably been 5 years ago now, that, that the animals would never ask us to suffer on their behalf. And I think that for a lot of us, the narrative is, that there is suffering in the animals, and that's our motivating factor. And we're trying to do as much as we can because we're aware of that suffering. We're trying to make it better. But in fact, the animals would never ask us to do that. And that's one of the reasons why people have these relationships with animals, because they're these amazing supports for us. So it's an important thing to remember that that's a narrative. And if it's not working for us, then we should think about changing the narrative. And I have a dog here in my nose. It's driving me nuts. It's like, it didn't bother me until I got on camera, of course. So that's why I have this thing with my nose right now. So here's some definitions to get us on the same page. I think it's important because there are a lot of different understandings of the terminology. So the definition of compassion fatigue is that it's the emotional, physical, social, and spiritual exhaustion that overtakes a person and causes a pervasive decline in their ability and energy to feel and care for others. So again, it's not that like you cared a lot and you got tired, it's that you care a lot. And what you find is that over time, your capacity to care is diminishing. Another definition is burnout. And sometimes people use these terms interchangeably, but burnout is really the psychological syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. So another way of comparing these two things is that, if when you're experiencing compassion fatigue, you're thinking like, oh my gosh, there's so much to do. How am I going to get it all done? When you are in burnout, it's more like, oh my gosh, there's so much to do and there's not enough left of me to do it. The thing that is important to note about this is that, especially for people who are doing direct care, but not exclusively people doing direct care, there is this element of vicarious traumatization where we are exposed to the trauma of others, which makes all of this way more complicated and challenging. So there's this definition that I love that's from trauma stewardship from Laura Van Lipsky, and she is a social worker. She's based here in Washington State, where I live. She's terrific if you ever get a chance to see her speak. But she talks about this notion that we are exposed, like this is all about how we manage ourselves and steward our own trauma. So what she says is, you think about it, we are all very different people. We all come from very different places. And so it's about who we are, how we come to do this work, how we make sense of it, and then how we learn from our experiences. So a lot of us have I saw in the chat, there are so many different people from so many different places and doing different things. So we all have very different origin stories about how we came to do this work and the nature of our work. But also we're all affected by our work in very different ways. And so you might have a colleague who does exactly the same job that you do, but they experience it in a much different way. And some people are very sensitive and other people aren't. And I could prove it if I were a terrible person by making you watch some horrible video, something happening to animals, and then asking you to tell me to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how upsetting it was to you. Some people would see that and think like, oh my gosh, that was a 10. I'm never going to get that image out of my head. And others might see it and think like, what's the big deal? I saw that on Tuesday and I'll see it again next Tuesday or whatever. So we have these different levels of sensitivity. We experience our work differently, but we all come to do this work. And then we have to think about how we're affected by it and then how we can make sense of it and learn from our experiences. And we're not always super clear about how this work affects us. I mean, it fundamentally changes the way that we view the world. right? If you have ever driven down the side or driven down the highway and seen like a bag of garbage or a Rubbermaid container on the side of the road and thought, oh geez, I bet there are kittens or puppies in there, then you'll know what I'm talking about, right? There are lots of people who just see that and think, oh, there's litter. Somebody threw some garbage on the side of the road. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. I'm pretty sure it's dismembered bodies. I'm not necessarily saying that's a more healthier approach, but that's the thing I think of. So the fact that our mind goes to go to these places it's a learned thing. And so it changes the way we experience the world. And it's kind of why we can't have nice things and we can't enjoy the cute little videos that we see shared on social media sometimes, because we know the story and the cruelty that's behind the cute thing that we're seeing on its face. And so I think what's important also to note here is this concept of how trauma can really affect the work that we do. And, you know, we could do a whole other workshop on trauma. This is like the tiniest, fastest little jogging tour of it. But it's important to understand that there are different kinds of trauma, right? So there's like primary trauma, and that's the trauma that happens to you. And then there's also secondary trauma. So that's if if you're hit by a car, that's primary trauma. Secondary trauma is where you are maybe the kennel tech that's working with the dog who is hit by a car. There's also tertiary trauma, where you're like the partner of the kennel tech working with the dog who's hit by a car. And so this exposure to trauma can really ripple out. And I've read in the literature, and I can't find the source, so it makes it seem like I'm making it up, but I promise I'm not, that 60% of people in caring professions have experienced some kind of primary themselves. And I remember reading that statistic and thinking, how is that possible? That seems like a lot. And then I started thinking about all of the people I know and all the trauma there is to go around. And I realized that 60% might even be a little bit low. And the reason I mention that is that trauma requires some very specific work to try to sort of work through and overcome and work with the professional. You cannot self-care your way out of traumatic experiences. And so if you are a person who has experienced some kind of primary trauma and have not been able to work with a professional in order to resolve that trauma, your continued exposure to the trauma of others in this work can make it much more difficult for you to sort of grapple with all the things that are going on. And it really will require professional intervention that I can't really recommend enough. I'll say it again several times throughout this presentation, but accessing mental health services is essential no matter what kind of work you do and kind of who you are in the world, but especially if you have had some sort of experience with primary trauma that has not been resolved. So this is what we call the compassion fatigue trajectory. So hopefully you can see, so there's the level of performance on the one axis and then exposure to stress over time. And there's like a dotted line that's indicating a decreasing level of performance over time. So what happens is that people come into this work, they're super stoked, they're super excited, they're really motivated, they're doing all the things, they're going the extra mile, they're just very enthusiastic, really high level of performance, really super enthusiastic, going for it. But with continued exposure to stress over time, that's not super sustainable. And they wind up sort of here in this irritability phase where they might begin to cut corners, avoid people, mock people, denigrate the people they serve, and start distancing themselves from friends and colleagues. And then there's the withdrawal phase where their enthusiasm turns sour, where they're tired and they don't want to talk about work, where they're starting to neglect family, friends, coworkers themselves, and trying to avoid sadness and pain. Then they wind up without any attention brought to it and continued exposure to stress over time. They can wind up over here in the zombie phase where their hopelessness turns to rage, where others appear ignorant or incompetent. There's disdain for others, no patience, no humor, no time. So this is sort of a bleak look. And sometimes people look at this and they think that the zealot phase is the good phase. And I can tell you that, in fact, it is not the great phase. And it's not largely because it's not sustainable, but also because I think it's most notably characterized by people who have really terrible boundaries and who are saying yes when they should be saying no. And it's not sustainable over the long term. It's also, this is not linear. So it's not as though once you leave the zealot phase, you're just doomed and you're going to wind up in the zombie phase. I mean, sometimes I feel like this can be my day. Sometimes I feel like I could be all the way in the zombie phase and then get a really good vacation in and discharge all that stress and come back really refreshed. But if I don't change my behaviors, it'll be very easy for me to slide back down this trajectory. The reason I mention this is that I think that it's important to understand this dynamic. And even if you've never seen it represented here in this sort of graph, if you've been around, you probably know what this looks like and you have seen it happen to people. And I think it's really important to note two things. One is, like, a lot of this behavior is really normalized. If I had $1 for every time I heard people say people suck or I hate people, I could retire and never work a day again in my life. It is so normalized in this. And a lot of these behaviors are just what happens. And it's just what happens when you do this work for a while. And it's not super healthy coping. The other thing I would say is that, we very rarely have conversations, and imagine if when somebody, instead of setting people up for failure, letting them come in and just kind of go to town and wear themselves out right off the bat, what if we had a conversation with new hires that said, hey, listen, want to show you this graph, learned it in a workshop. This is kind of what happens. And probably when you are starting in your role now, you're going to feel like you're in the zealot phase, but I want you to be really aware that this is what can happen. So I want you to think very carefully about setting your boundaries up now. This is a marathon and not a sprint. I want you to be here in the long term. I want you to say no if you need to say no, all of those things. And too often we're not having those conversations. And too often organizations are organized around taking advantage of people with all this energy and like working them to the ground because everybody else is super tired hanging out on this other side of the trajectory. So I think it's really important to keep this in mind and to be talking about it. There are a list of 12 signs and symptoms. These come from this book that I mentioned, Trauma Stewardship from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, that I highly recommend. I don't have time to go in to all of them, but I do want to call out just a couple real quick. This first is around anger and cynicism. Like we have a thing about justice, we observe injustice, we get mad about it, and we are angry. And that is like a normal reaction. But the problem is that a lot of us don't have great coping skills around dealing with anger, and it sticks around and we don't metabolize it. And when it sits there and it festers and accumulates over time, it really can lead to cynicism, where we're questioning everybody's intentions, we're questioning everybody's motives, everybody's a liar and they're terrible. And also our sense of humor can take a really dark turn. And the reason I call this out is that I think a lot of times when people think of compassion fatigue, they're thinking of somebody who is like crying and really weepy and sad. That is certainly a way that some people manifest their emotions when it relates to compassion fatigue. And that's normal and healthy, and crying can actually discharge stress. So like, I'm all for it. But we don't always notice, if you are a person who didn't used to cry all the time and all of a sudden you're crying on your way home from work or while you're cooking dinner or when you're taking a bath or when you're having to go back to work on your Monday, and you might notice like, I don't remember that I used to cry this much. This seems new and weird and I should probably get help. But we don't always notice the anger stuff because it creeps up on us. And so, it happens so slowly over time. We're not always really able to acknowledge or to understand what our anger looks like, but if we had some sort of neutral third party observer, we could say like, what does my anger look like? They'd probably be able to tell us very easily. So the people who are the sad crying ones notice and either get help or they leave the field. But in my experience, the people who are angry wind up sticking around for a really long time. And that doesn't always serve the industry very well either. The next thing I'll just mention is this idea that it's never enough. A lot of us, when we feel like there's too much to do, we try to do more. And that's where we get in the situation of kind of undermining our ability to do our best work. The other thing is that a lot of us have this narrative that our best isn't good enough. And, like if our best were good enough, we would have won the case, or we would have saved that animal's life, or we would have gotten that bill passed, or whatever, insert the thing. And that leads us feeling like our best isn't good enough. And I just want to put in a plug to say to you now that your best absolutely is good enough. I mean, of course it is. Like, whose best are you supposed to be doing? If you're not doing your best, then you should have a conversation with yourself about ways that you might be able to adjust that. But I also think I don't know anybody who's not doing their best. And also, we can do our best and still not get the outcome that we were hoping for. And it's not a reflection on our best. So we can talk more about that some other time, but I just want to remind you because I think that narrative is so pervasive in this business. And so here are the rest of these signs. Really encourage you to go check out the book. And actually, we'll share with Allie a list of resources for both my stuff and Lindsay's at the end so that you can kind of get this book. There's a link to it and you can take a look at it. There's a bunch of other videos and other things. The other thing I just want to mention, and this kind of touches to what Lindsay's going to talk about, is that there can be organizational symptoms of compassion fatigue too. So leaders and organizations should pay attention to this, not just because they should care about their staff and care about individual humans and their well-being, which I think is a great thing to think about, but also when you have a bunch of people in a system experiencing compassion fatigue, it really can show up and affect your organization's ability to do its best work. When you have a staff that is roiling with compassion fatigue, you're going to see things like reluctance to change and lack of flexibility and inability for teams to work well together. So it's really incumbent upon leaders and organizations to take this seriously and not just like hope that their staff's going to figure it out and take care of themselves, but rather create the systems that are going to allow their staff to succeed, which is what Lindsay's going to kind of mention here. The next thing I just want to mention is that, above all else, and this is my other little plug, professional assistance is often required. And, if there is an issue, there are all kinds of things that can get in the way of people's ability to really sort of manage all of this on their own. And so much of the narrative that we have is like, pick yourself up by the bootstraps and figure it out yourself. And it's not that easy. And especially if you have some sort of chemical imbalance in your brain, like the stuff that we're talking about managing your own anxiety and like having a gratitude practice is not going to feel super accessible. And so there are lots of reasons or times when people should seek out professional help, right? If people are experiencing compassion fatigue, trying to do the work and it's not getting better, getting worse, or they're feeling hopeless or helpless, or, having suicidal thoughts, or they have clinical depression or PTSD, or a history of unresolved trauma or pain, professional assistance is absolutely warranted. And I think there's still too much stigma around accessing mental health services that I feel like I'll just keep singing it from the rooftops as much as I need to, because that can absolutely help with the struggle that we're experiencing in our work as well. So, this is a much longer conversation than we are able to have right now about sort of, the human brain. You might be surprised I can't cover it in just a couple of minutes. What I think is essential about this is for you to understand that our brains are not built for being in a constant state of stress. The stress response we have in our bodies is intended to like give us the juice we need to get out of a jam. And when we are stressed and stressed and stressed and stressed, our body keeps pumping out these stress hormones and we don't metabolize it. And when we don't metabolize it, that really can lead to some long-term health complications. So that what is important to understand is that there are things that we can do when we have acute moments of stress, when we're like, something just really upsetting just happened, to try to calm our physiology and to bring ourselves back to a calm state. But often we have to practice those things when we're not in a moment of stress, because we're not going to have them available to us when we're in the middle of a freak out. So, the very dumbed down description of your autonomic nervous system is that you have your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic is where you are when you're experiencing a threat, and your parasympathetic is where you are when you are able to be calm and non-anxious and have access to language. And obviously, if you're looking at these side by side, you can imagine your parasympathetic nervous system is the ideal place to spend your time. But often you are likely to be triggered into your sympathetic nervous system potentially dozens of times a day, and it just winds up getting stacked. And if we don't have a way to metabolize those stress hormones every day, it can make it really challenging. So there are a variety of things we can do. And I said, we have these resources. It's got like TED Talks and webinars and links to articles and all that kind of stuff. But there are a few different kind of categories. I mean, there are things, the way that we think about the work and the way we bring ourselves to the work, that can help us to sort of relate to the ongoing stress that is this work that we've chosen. But also the stress is still going to come. So there are things we can do with our physiology. There are things like different breathing practices. There's lots of interesting research about how breathing affects our overall well-being. So there's different kinds of cyclical breathing, right? Where there's 4 square breathing, where you inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, or inhale for 4 seconds, exhale hold it for 7 seconds, exhale for 8 seconds. You can do that a few times and actually shift your physiology. You can soften your pelvic floor, which I know sounds a little bit woo-woo, but those are the muscles that you use to hold in your urine stream. But research also indicates those are the muscles animals use to tuck their tail between their legs. So it's sort of the same thing. When the tail is tucked, they're in that stressed time. So you can learn how to soften those muscles to relax. And that can shift your body over to the parasympathetic nervous system. You can also do things like orienting yourself to your environment, like looking around to see the shapes and the colors of the things around you. Like I have a blue glasses case and my phone cover is black, and I have a napkin that's green and red. I've got a mouse pad that's red and a mouse that's blue. I could count books on my bookshelf. I might think about how my bum feels in my chair, or how my hands feel on my desk, just to sort of bring my amygdala back online, to sort of calm me down so that I'm able to to be a non-anxious presence enough to get to where I have access to language and creativity in my parasympathetic nervous system. But these are things you have to practice and when the stakes are low, so that they are available and accessible to you when the stakes are high. Like if you don't do any practice about softening your pelvic floor and then have something stressful happen like tomorrow and think like, oh, what am I supposed to soften my pelvic? Like that's not going to help. That's not going to be the thing, but you can practice it. And again, there are resources and that we'll share with you after the workshop that can help you to build this resilience. So when that thing happens, you can go, I got this. I know what I need to do so that I can be calm and get back on track and be able to make reasonable decisions and have access to language when you're in your parasympathetic nervous system. So again, it's about becoming a non-anxious presence, dealing with your physical state, dealing with your mental state. It's normal to be stressed out. Also, it is temporary. It doesn't always feel like it's temporary. It feels like it's going on for a really long time, but it is temporary and it will pass. We just have to remember what we can do that can help us. And then also remember to do the thing, like knowing that something helps and then remembering to do the thing that helps, kind of two different things. So this is a great list of self-care that we can prioritize. And I think it's important to keep in mind. It actually comes from the book To Save a Starfish, and which is also a book that I recommend. And each of these things is a really important piece. But as Lindsay is about to talk about, you have to have time and space in your life to do some of these things. It's nice to talk about having enough time to go on a hike, but if you are working every moment of your life, it's hard to take that time away. So again, jogging tour. I'm gonna, Lindsay, you may be able to just take it over from me, or I can stop the share either way. See what it does if you can share it. If not, I'll stop.
Can you all see my screen now?
Nope.
No. Okay.
Oh, now I can. Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Fancy. Look at us getting so good at this.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's been a year.
All right, take it away.
Thanks, Hilary. So
Sure.
for everyone on, we're just super happy to chat with you. This is by no means like an extensive training, but hopefully we can give you some concrete ideas on what might work for you. And side note, if you hear the wailing cries of a puppy in my house, it's because I moonlight as somebody who watches other people's dogs. And COVID has created a significant number of puppies who have never been alone. So there's a dog in my foster room right now who thinks that his life has come to an end because he's not directly with human beings. And I'm a terrible dog trainer because I'm ignoring him. So I just wanted to put that caveat out if you can hear him barking.
Oh, everybody knows that about you, Lindsay.
I'm so heartless. Teaching boundaries is my thing. So what I want to talk to you all about is how do you actually create the space to do the things for you personally that will help to keep you balanced. And the list that Hilary just shared of self-care things is awesome, but also we recognize that as individuals, each of us has different things that will help us to de-stress and then other things that don't work for us. And so we're not going to give you some kind of prescription of what may or may not work for you. We trust that either you've already figured that out or that can be part of the individualized work that you're doing. So what I don't know that we talk about enough is sort of how we got to this point, not just as nonprofit organizations, but also as a culture in the United States and internationally. We very much live in a time where we believe, because we've been given a lot of cues about this, that our professional worth is related to our availability. That is a metric of what our organizations or what our team members look at to decide whether or not we are whether we care enough, whether we are ready for another leadership position. So there's a lot of cultural expectations on us. And I want to talk a little bit about that first. So some of the ways that organizations create this culture where you feel like you have to be available 24/7 is this mission guilt piece. Whether you all are working in rescues, shelters, if you are an attorney working on behalf of animals, you all have come into this space because you care deeply about the issue. And so you have intrinsic pressure, you have your own personal pressure you put on yourself to show up every day and to advocate for animals or for their families or whatever the field of work that you're in. And then we have the external pressure because most of our organizations are really like terrible at boundaries, whether they mean to be or not. And that's because as an organization or as a team or a department, you all are trying to work towards the same goals. And so we sometimes need to just take a minute and recognize that we are pushing against a cultural expectation that is not the norm. I mean, creating boundaries with work is not what most people in our country or frankly around the world are doing. And so this is really some new, I think COVID has really brought up a lot of new questions about what it means to have work-life balance. And we can talk COVID specific issues as well in the Q&A portion. But in addition, we have limited staffing, like even at the Humane Society of the United States, where we have hundreds of employees, I think any one of us would say that that still is not enough for what we're trying to accomplish on a daily basis. So every single person is doing, you know, the work of 3 or 4 different people trying to achieve the goals that we have in mind. And I know for sure that those of you that are working in shelters, rescues, spay, neuter clinics, community cat work, et cetera, that there's never enough people, even if you have robust volunteer programs, which is one way to address that, you still have limited staffing. And so if you are trying to take more time off, whether that's a full-fledged vacation or simply just not being available for your work in the evenings, you can't do that unless you feel like you have support for the inevitable emergencies that come up. And we'll talk about some solutions to that in a moment. And then I think clearly one of the things that has made this just incredibly difficult to do is technology. And technology has all kinds of perks to it. We're sitting here on Zoom because technology has given us an option. But part of the reason I'm passionate about this is because I was really fortunate to be entering my professional career right on the line of when technology was coming in. And so my first job at an animal shelter, I lived in a house that did not have internet. I live in New Hampshire, so it's not uncommon that there's rural areas without internet even now. I had a cell phone, but it didn't work at my house. So I had to like drive into town to check my voicemail. And so I had a landline that had an answering machine, which is crazy. And so if I left on my day off to go for a hike or do whatever it is that I do, work could call me and I could come home and see that message when I got home, but that could be 8 hours later. And so we sort of automatically had to create emergency plans and chain of command sort of structure so that somebody else could make decisions when I wasn't there, because we literally had to do that. And then just a couple years later was when all the cell phone stuff and the laptops and the internet and everything really exploded. And so now we are really inundated with not just one kind of communication strategy, but 17 of them. So we have our email, we have Slack, we have Instant Messenger, we have text messaging, we have calls, we have social media messaging. And if you're introverted like I am, the variety of ways that we are connecting with other people every day, that in itself, even if the frequency is low, is exhausting. Extroverts tend to have a little bit better time with that, but even for anyone, the amount of diversity in how we communicate is a lot. And then, you know, the good news is more and more organizations are creating structures that have paid time off so that people can actually take time and be paid for it. But I rarely see an organization that is actively modeling that or rewarding it. You may have a boss or leadership or people on your team who take vacation, but I think there's always this tendency to sort of say, to feel like you're going to miss something when you're gone. Certainly you're not being actively encouraged to take the vacation, like, yay, I'm so glad that you get to take a week off. And the more that we can proactively congratulate each other for actually taking some time away, the more that culturally we will show that we support this balance. And so there's really 2 pieces to this. I used to think that it was my job as an individual to create boundaries with work, to have impulse control. I think we mentioned previously that I'm a dog trainer, so I'm big on impulse control. And so, you know, I set up these structures that worked for me as an individual. But what I have learned, of course, over time is that if an organization doesn't support it, I can still do those things. But it doesn't, I feel more stressed even now, even though I've had great boundaries with work for 15-ish years now, I still feel stressed occasionally about it. because I've never worked for an organization that fully embraced this work-life balance. And so I'm going to talk about the organizational responsibility first, particularly if you are in a position of leadership, but also literally if you manage one person. So whether that's a paid staff person, interns, volunteers, law clerks, whatever it is, if you are in a position of power, you have a whole lot of ability to show somebody that you truly support them having some balance in their life and working with them on how your team can adjust to be able to ensure that they actually have some time away. And so modeling is huge. Because I am so vocal about my work-life balance, the people who work around me or for me see that modeling. They see, okay, well, if my boss is away for 2 weeks and she doesn't check her email the entire time, then that makes me feel better when I go to take vacation and I do the same thing, because clearly I'm not going to take advantage of those things and then require my staff to be available 24/7 if I'm not doing that. Certainly the higher up in an organization you go, that you can see the modeling of work-life balance, the better. Because oftentimes what happens, depending on how large your organization is maybe a handful of people have figured out how to have some balance, but if your CEO or your leadership group really is constantly writing to you at 1 a.m, or asking for really quick responses to projects, which isn't really respecting your time management, then you're fighting against a culture that's really asking you to be available and working as often as possible. The thing that I would recommend for this is it really should start from the person who's in power, right? Because it takes a lot of emotional labor to go to somebody who is above you and to say, hey, I'm struggling to have work-life balance because you're pretty terrible at it. So I would recommend that as individuals, we sort of acknowledge if we're not good at it. And it's okay if you're a manager and you do work all the time, just literally say that to your staff. Say, I have not figured out how to unplug from work yet, but I'm trying some different tactics. And I want you to know that even though I haven't figured it out yet, I really would like you all to be able to do the things that you want to do. Just acknowledging the weaknesses that we have goes a long way. And then even though we have paid time off, we don't totally reward it. At HSUS, we have a wellness points process for our health insurance, which is great. That's a cool perk. But how awesome would it be if the person who took all of their vacation every year got the most wellness points, right? There are ways that we can incentivize actually having time away from work that not only gives an incentive to somebody who's individually struggling with it, but also reinforces that the organization truly supports this. And one of the biggest hurdles to having balance is that you may be the only person at your organization or at your company that can do the thing that you do. And so when you are the specialist in something, it is really difficult to take time away, especially if that job tends to have some emergencies to it. So animal control officers come to mind. Those of you who are working in politics, politics does not have any boundaries. Folks who are working in legislatures do not have work-life balance in my experience. People who are working in the media do not have work-life balance, right? So we might be intersecting with other categories of professionals who really struggle with this as well. And one of the only ways we can work within that system is to have more people who are cross-trained on the things that we do. So I'm one of a handful of people at my organization that responds to certain kinds of media requests that we get. And I used to be the only one who focused on XYZ topic. And over time, we've added more and more people to that group because I don't want to get a call on a Saturday every single time that a newspaper wants to run an article about the thing that I'm an expert on. So that's one way that organizations can really ensure. Now, if you're a total control freak and you don't want anybody else to do your job, I hope that you work. I understand I'm also a control freak, but I hope that you can pick pieces of what you do to train other people on so that at least you're practicing delegating and giving away parts of that to other people. And then it at least reduces the topics that you might be contacted for when you're trying not to work. And then similarly, after hours, right? Like we fully recognize that animal welfare, social justice issues, et cetera, those are not Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 things, right? So what I find happens is that organizations, instead of having one person who's on call or a rotating schedule of who's on call, all of us just keep checking our phones in case something happens. And then we all like panic and go into our sympathetic nervous systems and try to address the thing. This is truly as simple as figuring out what the after hours protocol looks like. And this will depend on what your job is, what kinds of emergencies tend to come up, et cetera. And then the organization can set standards for how you are contacted. So at our organization, email is a very common form of communication during the workday. We're a very email-based organization. I know some organizations are more Slack-based. And so during the workday, when I'm working, I'm available by email. There's usually some Skype, IM kind of messages that are coming through. So I have to have a different type of communication for after hours. Otherwise, I'm just sitting on my phone checking my email all the time, right? So for me, email is the thing when I'm working, and sometimes phone calls and text messages. But afterwards, you have to text or call me if you need me to address something after hours. And I'm just going to say this because sometimes it's helpful to hear that it can work. It has been years that I have not checked email in the evening. I stop about 4:30 every day, and I do not check email again until 9 in the morning. I don't check email from Friday night until Monday morning. I definitely don't check email when I'm on vacation. And my record so far is 17 days of no work. And so I say that partly to brag, but also to like give you some sense of hope that like you really can do it. And I've worked in jobs where there was a ton of emergencies that happened, where I was overseeing our cruelty investigations program. And so there are things that would happen where law enforcement needed assistance on a Saturday. And really what it took was just creating these protocols for after hours so that I wasn't always the one that was responding. And then let's say in a perfect world, all of our organizations love that we have balance. They love our boundaries. They love that we say no. We will get there at some point. But we also as individuals really need to take accountability for our own boundaries. And this is simple ideas, but they are not in any way, shape, or form easy. So take the things that you think either might work really well for you in your job, or maybe there's some of the stuff that you do really well now, and then you can add on a couple of other tools to your toolkit. Particularly during COVID-19, if you had not worked from home before and now you're working from home, it's really critical to mark the end of the workday. And it could be as simple as getting up and like doing some crazy weird dance at the end of your day, some incongruent behavior to working. Almost every day I end the workday and I leave the house. I'm lucky to do that because I'm in New England and we have a lot of space here, but I have to get away from my computer, away from the stuff I've been doing all day to mark the end of the workday. And usually I go and do something physical. I can't check my work email when I'm swimming. I can't do it when I'm biking. And so I do something that at least gives me like an hour of not repeating the behavior that I've been doing all day. One of the easiest things, well, hopefully it's easy for you during COVID, even in a small living space, hopefully you all have figured out like there's a place in your house or apartment that you work, and that computer and work phone, they don't follow you to your bedroom, to your living room, to your kitchen, or whatever the spaces are that indicate to your brain that you're done working. If we walk around with our work phones throughout our house, then we're always going to be in the mindset that we're working. So my house is not large. I'm right next to my living room. When I'm done with the workday, my laptop closes, my work phone stays in this room. And about once a night, I'll open my phone just to see if someone called or texted. But I do not click on that email icon because the moment I open it, I'm just working again. So let's say that you figured out some boundaries, but you have some people in your professional circle who don't have good boundaries, politicians and the media and other teammates and whatever. There may need to be some conversations that you have with them about how you're trying to have more boundaries. And sometimes these are pretty easy to have, like your BFF is always messaging you on a Saturday about work and you're just like, hey, can we just not talk about work while we're together, whatever. But there can also be really difficult ones. When I took over as chief operating officer at one of the shelters I worked at, the previous person in my position had one of our major donors had full access to him. So she was calling on the weekends, in the evenings, anytime she had a question. She was an amazing donor. She wasn't high maintenance, but whenever she had a question, she didn't think about the time that she was calling. And it was my first week of work, and I was like, you know, the pressure of like being at a new job. She called me on a Saturday, and I was like, ugh. So I sat down with her the next week, and I just said, you know, thank you so much for your support. I want to work with you on the challenges that this organization has, but in order for me to stay here long term, I'm going to need my rest. And so if it's not a like legit emergency, and we talked about what an emergency actually was, please just wait to connect with me when I'm back at work, right? And here's what I'll tell you is that those conversations are super intimidating. Totally admit it. I've never, ever had one go poorly. I told the governor of the state of New Hampshire that I needed 10 days off before the legislative session and to only call me if there was like a serious emergency with the bill we were working on. And the response that his office gave me was, that's awesome. Have a great vacation. We'll see you in a week and a half. So I promise you that you can have these conversations with people who have a power dynamic that might make you uncomfortable. And you can do this one of two ways. You can start with the really easy conversations until you build up the habit, or you can take the relationships that's most impacting your work-life balance and just rip the Band-Aid off and start from there. And then you also have to have impulse control. You can't be emailing your colleagues at 10 o'clock at night and expecting them to respect your boundaries. So Outlook has delayed delivery. I understand during COVID that you may need to work outside of like normal working hours, whatever your schedule looks like, but there are ways to send an email or a message that says, I don't expect you to answer this till you're working. Like we've put that on some of our email signatures because we have a lot of international employees who are getting our emails at really weird times, right? And then lastly, like we have to take time off, and it's really depressing how few people in the United States of any profession take vacation, even though you're paid for it. And it's even more depressing, the percentage of people who are afraid to take time off. And so if you are at an organization where you do feel supported in taking time off, I really would encourage you to do so. I think with the pandemic, people feel like, well, why would I take time off? I can't go anywhere. I would argue we need time off more now than we ever have needed it, even if it's literally just being in your house and not working. In my experience, the longer the vacation, the more you will get from it, because we will go into a vacation with stress and we will start to feel stressed again as we come back towards work. So for me, that means the 2 days before vacation, I'm usually pretty stressed because I'm trying to, you know, do all the things, which I'll never be able to get them all done. And then I'm feeling stressed on the way back in about what did I miss? Because I have not checked email. I have no idea what's been going on at work. And so I feel a little bit of anxiety about that. So if I can get 10 full days between those two spikes in stress, I have found that it regularly reduces my overall stress. And not only that, like it reminds me why I'm doing the work. I usually have my best ideas when I'm on vacation. I'm not even thinking about work, but I'll just be like doing something else. And I'm like, it'd be really cool if we could do this program. And so I think it's helpful to understand that you're going to feel stressed, especially if you're not used to taking time off. And the more that you practice it, the better it will be. You will not always have fruitful vacations. There are vacations I've taken where I have been totally stressed the entire time. And then I've been stressed when I got back. And then there's been vacations that I thought were going to be stressful because all this stuff was going on at work, and they turned out to actually be really refreshing. And so I don't know which ones are going to be helpful or not, which is why I schedule at least 3 of them a year. So it's a lot. I'm sure some of you are trying some of these things, but it really is doable. It just takes practice and intention, and hopefully the support of at least your team members, if not the entire organization that you work for. So I will end there and see if we have some questions or if anybody wants to discuss anything specific. And of course, Hilary and I are always available as individuals. If you have any questions that you don't, sometimes this conversation, like it's not comfortable to raise, like my boss hates when I take vacation. You want to talk about that individually with us, then we're here for that.
And you and I have the same boss, so it's easy, Lindsay.
This was such a great topic. Thank you so much. You know, when you were speaking, I just kept thinking, if I had known about this when I was a prosecutor, I would have saved myself a lot of Tylenol PM to help me sleep at night, which my liver did not appreciate, or all the dirty martinis that I drank to get me through it. So, which is not recommended. So thank you. This was amazing, and it's so helpful in no matter what anybody is doing in their work. I mean, this is so critical for everybody to know. So I'm checking the chat to see if anybody has any questions. If you do, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have a couple minutes left.
And if anyone has stuff that they've tried that has worked, or stuff you've tried and it's totally gone terrible, like Hilary and I are always collecting examples of things that people are trying.
So I actually created a health and wellness business because I was trying so many natural things and different things to help relax me, you know, because I was a lobbyist in DC, and that is one of the most thankless, difficult things that you can do, where you're never making any progress on anything. So yeah, and it just ended up being a business because I got so involved in it. I'm not recommending anybody create a second business for themselves. But that's how much help I needed.
Yeah. There's a really good question here about, have we tried no calls on Fridays? So Zoom fatigue, holy schmoly. So Hilary and I are in the same department at HSUS. We as a department have agreed to a norm that we will not have meetings on Fridays. So it doesn't go perfectly. Occasionally one of us has to do something, usually with an external group, but Fridays have become a safe place to actually get the work done. Or to sleep in and like start a little bit later, whatever the thing is that you need. The other thing that we've tried with minimal success is to not have hour-long meetings. So to try to either start 10 minutes late or end 10 minutes early so that you're not jumping from one meeting to the next meeting. So we've tried some of that.
Yeah, my own team inside that same department, we don't schedule meetings with each other on Mondays or Fridays. It does mean there are a lot of meetings on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, but I am able to have meetings with other people, like you said, externally, Lindsay, because I know that I have Mondays and Fridays and I'm not trying to squeeze them in. And also to that point about 50-minute meetings, we have found, instead of trying to end it 10 minutes early, starting at 10 minutes late assures that you're going to be done on time. Otherwise you can just keep going, you know, like, we still have 10 minutes before the next call. So we really are better at keeping in that 10 minutes if we start our meetings at 11:10 instead of 11. Pro tip. Oh yeah, who has the answer the phone plan? That's a really good one. I think I'm just in the midst right now of creating a, like, who do you need, who on my team is the person you need to talk to about which thing? Because a lot of times, you know, people will copy everybody because they don't know who, you know, they're like throwing something against the wall to see what sticks. And so all of us are getting it. We don't have a clear plan always on who is the person to take it. So we're going to both try to direct people externally to the right person on the team to begin with, but then also really clarify among the team, you know, how we're going to make decisions about which person needs to field the question when they come in. It's good to do that stuff proactively. I'm excited to spend time thinking about it.
Yeah, fantastic suggestions. I mean, to really cover, no matter what your job is, no matter what the work you're doing is, really, really fantastic suggestions. So thank you so much. We are so appreciative that, you know, you came in here and really shared this with us. So
happy to do it. And also, I'm sorry, just really quickly, Allie, we will send you a copy of the presentation and those follow-up things. I'll send them to you via email after this.
Perfect. Yeah, everyone who registered will get a link to this recording. I will send them the PDF of that, and we'll make sure that you get all that information. So we're very thankful that you were here and that you were very interested in this topic. And Lindsay and Hilary, thank you. We're very appreciative of your time and helping us here. Great. So before we end, our next presentation next month is on May 13th, and Hilary Reddig is going to be talking about overcoming procrastination and perfectionism. So this is a really good topic, you know, especially for those of us who are, as I like to affectionately call us, control management specialists. So this is going to be a really good topic. So thank you to everyone. We are, you know, very happy that you're here and interested in our webinar series. And Hilary and Lindsay, again, thank you so much. And we hope to see you next month. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.